Welcome. My name is Professor Helen Payne, and I'm the founding editor-in-chief of the journal Body, Movement and Dance in Psychotherapy. This is an international peer-reviewed journal published by Taylor and Francis. Our articles relate to embodiment, and particularly embodiment in psychotherapy. It is the only scholarly journal wholly dedicated to the growing fields of body psychotherapy, somatic psychology, and dance movement psychotherapy. The importance of the role of the body and movement in manifesting expression, insight, and change, and in promoting recovery is increasingly being recognised in the fields such as neuro and cognitive sciences and psychology. The journal encourages broad and in-depth discussion of issues relating to research activities, theory, clinical practice, professional development, and personal reflections. Our journal provides essential reading for all body psychotherapists, somatic psychologists, dance movement psychotherapists, and creative arts therapists. It also provides important material for all mental and physical health professionals, such as psychiatrists, psychologists, psychotherapists, counsellors, GPs, and other relevant mental health professionals. We are delighted to launch and fund the present series of interviews showcasing international pioneers from the fields of body and dance movement psychotherapies. We are grateful for their time and participation and value their contribution to disseminating history, theory, research, and practice. Additional appreciations go to the interviewers, who also volunteered their time freely, and to the recording editors of this series, Seb Siracusa and Jim O'Connell. Thank you. To welcome you to this conversation with Michel Heller, who's world-renowned and very well-known body psychotherapist, practitioner, theoretician, researcher, and prolific author as well. So thank you so much for agreeing to this interview, Michel. Say hello to the audience.
Well, hello to you all, and I'm very flattered to be interviewed by Helen, who's also a world-renowned body psychotherapist and researcher and teacher. And I'm already looking forward for a very interesting discussion.
Thank you, Michel. Just to correct you, I'm a dance movement psychotherapist, which isn't the same. We have different paths within the body, obviously more creative, expressive, and different. But I just wanted to particularly ask you about your history, because I know both your father and your mother were very influential. As a child, you had these two influences on your trajectory for your career. And I just wonder if you could say a little bit about those influences for the audience, please.
So I'll mostly talk of my father's influence, who comes from a Viennese family of geologists, scientists, with mixed religious belongings, Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, which created an atmosphere where they were really interested in what's interesting, what's useful, and not what's true or untrue, or what's scientific or unscientific. And so they brought me up in an environment where we talked of Chinese philosophy, Hindu philosophy, science, various philosophers. Then also my grandfather was a publisher, and he published very different people like Thomas Mann and Freud and people like that. So that on his side, I was in a family which wasn't a real believer, but which was very, I would say, anthropological, in the sense that they believe that the systems, the different ways people think, are important to understand the people. So you need to understand Chinese philosophy to appreciate Chinese art, or you need to understand the Catholic religion if you really want to appreciate middle-aged churches in Europe and so on. So that was the sort of broad frame. And my father first, so in Vienna, just before the war, the situation was, of course, delicate when you had some Jewish members in your ancestry. He was mainly doing theater in a fairly famous school directed by a man called Max Reinhardt, who was one of the persons who created the Salzburg Festival. And then he migrated to the United States, where he became a historian. and where he met my mother. He was in Harvard, she was in Radcliffe, so it began like a love story. And then after the war, uh, he and others, for example, with the anthropologist Margaret Mead and other people from Harvard, decided to react against the fact that Europe was suddenly cut in two halves, and that scientists from the communist side and from the democratic side could no more talk together. So he participated in the creation of an institution called the Salzburg Seminar. And to create that seminar, which still exists today, he
Indeed.
managed to convince Max Reinhardt uh, uh, to lend his house in Salzburg for that institution.
Mm,
Um, and in this institution, he and my mother and their other friends met, among other people, various historians, which led my father and my mother to go and live in Paris, where my father worked with a famous French historian called Fernand Braudel. And I was born there with my twin brother. Uh,
oh,
and
twin.
my mother, in the meantime, she didn't really have a job. She finished a degree on middle age art and churches, and but she had more of a worldly life, I would say. But she practiced a lot of dancing, of gymnastics, of yoga, of meditation, and
Mm,
so that
mm,
in my childhood family, working with one's soul and body and intelligence and
mm,
imagination was how I was brought up and how my
mm,
brothers were brought up too.
mm.
So
So
I don't
very
know if that
holistic.
answers a bit. Yeah.
Oh, indeed, yes, and I can see the thread of the body through both parents actually as well. Um, yes, so going on from that, you were in Paris, and I know you did study with Jean Piaget. How did you get to be a student of his?
So when I was about 10, my parents divorced, and my mother went to live in Scotland. My father stayed in Paris. They both remarried. And my brother and I were put in a boarding school in Switzerland. So then we lived in Switzerland. And I had the US passport in those days, and I could have become French. But I had two issues with that. The first one was if the the US Army wanted to send me to fight in the Vietnam War. I was A1 number 6 in the lottery, so the risk was high, and I didn't want to fight in that war. Actually, I even have today very good Vietnamese friends, so I had nothing
Mm,
against Vietnamese people. And I didn't want to take the risk of having to go into the Algerian War either.
mm,
So I had to stay in Switzerland.
mm,
Now, all the branches that interested me in those days um, were not really well taught, at least not to my satisfaction, in Switzerland. That is mainly theater, sociology, anthropology. Those were the branches I was aiming at. And there was
mm,
nothing in my environment which really attracted my attention. And so I asked my father for an advice, as he knew a lot of people in the various sciences and so on. And he says, well, there's one guy everybody says he's very interesting called Jean Piaget. Now, psychology was not our field in our family. We had, the discussions were more on the development of human cultures and societies
mm,
and
mm,
economics, and being obsessed by what happens in oneself was not the usual topic of discussion. But
yeah,
I hadn't thought about psychology. But finally, I entered into psychology because Piaget was so famous, and bizarrely, I found it very interesting, and I'm still a fascinated psychologist today. And one of the first things that I told already Helen about was that Piaget Piaget's approach was basically sensory motor. He was a biologist who decided to study the development of intelligence because it is a manifestation of a biological organism. And he wanted to understand the link between developing organs and developing ways of thinking and ways of relating and so on. And so his main strategy was really to explore how children played with toys and uh, started to understand how they could improve their way of handling toys. He actually got this direction from Piaget, who was one of his mentors, and who also, in a way, is known as one of the creators of body psychotherapy.
Yeah, indeed,
So
indeed.
that's how I arrived at Piaget.
Mm. So interesting. So interesting. So the next step then, after Piaget, you go on with this more focused, I suppose, more focused interest, because you only go for what's interesting, with the sensory motor. So how did you build on
But
that next?
maybe not for what is interesting, but for what interested me, at
Yeah,
least.
yes, yes,
Uh,
of course, of course.
In those days, even when you studied, like I did, experimental psychology, so the sort of the toughest scientific approaches that psychologists can develop, we also, most of us students, believed that it was important to work on ourselves, not only to understand others. And so I began with the psychoanalysis, and
Mm,
I also was doing theater, and I was also doing meditation. And so
mm,
already mixing up such approaches is problematic in itself, because some may say, well, you can't do psychoanalysis and meditation at the same time, or things like that. And my psychoanalyst finally thought that the best would be that I join a group of bioenergetics. They weren't directly trained by Alexander Lowen, but they were inspired by Alexander Lowen. And I
mm-hmm,
discovered
mm-hmm,
body psychotherapy and enjoyed it very much. And at the same time, I also began with a friend of mine to teach exploring oneself through movements to small children in a very free school. My main
mm,
exercise was that one member of the class had to play one of his dreams to the other kids.
mm.
And then all the kids were directed by that kid to create the whole dream as a play.
Like a
And so we
psychodrama,
mixed up. What?
a bit like
What did
Moreno's
you?
psychodrama.
Well, a bit. I didn't know about it, but it's quite
Yeah,
close.
yeah, yeah.
Yes, maybe
Was
it
this in
was in the
Switzerland
air.
still?
Yeah,
Was this a free school but in Switzerland still?
in Geneva.
Oh, in
It was a
Geneva.
free
Okay.
school in Geneva.
Oh, okay. Was it
Um,
was it like Summerhill type free school,
a
like
bit. It
AS
was a
Neil?
bit. It was inspired by Summerhill,
Ah,
and
okay.
Reich was often mentioned. And actually, my
Mm,
ex-psychoanalyst also, who was also a Reichian, he mixed up both, uh, was also
hmm
involved in that school. And so my idea was that on top of learning the sensory motor aspects of psychology at a scientific level, I wanted to deepen my knowledge of a more practical ways of exploring that same dimension. And we decided that we had to look for a decent uh, Reichian oriented psychotherapist. And one of us managed to uh, convince Gerda Boyesen who was living in London, to come and
hmm
create uh, a training group of her biodynamic method. It was called the Gerda Boyesen method at the time, not
hmm
biodynamic.
hmm
And I got involved in that training and loved it. And for me, it was very complementary to Piaget. Although Gerda Boysen was also very much in spirituality and in energy,
hmm
which my Piagetian teachers hated. It made things difficult for my relation with the university that I was involved in, Reichen methods. That improved later on, but at the beginning it was difficult. But for me, it was, in a way, practically speaking, uh, very complementary. That is, we were working on how thoughts, emotions, movements all influence each other,
Mm.
and
Mm.
on questions of how to improve the coordination between these many facets of a human organism.
Mm. Oh, that's fascinating. Gerda Boyesen. Yes, I did do one session. She had a stethoscope. I had to lay on a bed, and she was listening to the gurgles in my abdomen. And we did talk as well. It wasn't just that. It was very, very, very complex, I thought, trying to understand what's going on from the gut brain, if you like. But
Yes,
you
I
still
still
use a stethoscope. You
yes, I
still
still
use
use
that?
it. Well, now we have
Yeah.
a more modern stethoscope. That is, we have a loudspeaker. And so the
Oh,
patient
wow.
can listen
Can hear.
to his
Yeah.
gut noises
Yeah.
while he's talking about a dream. And if
Ah,
suddenly he talks of a horse and I hear a lot of noise in the belly, I say, hey, what's so important about the horse for your body?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so we could even
Fascinating.
use it to analyze dreams.
Fascinating. From the person, the actual client's perspective, of course, rather than
Yes.
saying the horse equals this. What's the client associate with that animal?
Yes. Actually, I published an article on that in the book you recently published, where I wrote an
Y-
article on the embodiment of dreams,
That's right.
where I
You did
show how
indeed.
you can mix various body techniques and dream analysis in a quite Freudian sense, in a way, and how
Mm,
that allows us to see aspects which were seldom explored of dream life.
indeed. Wonderful. So there you were linking the depth psychology, if you like, depth psychology and body psychotherapy coming together. And what about the links between? I know you work with baby as well. What about the links between psychoanalysis and in terms of conceptual framework and your understanding of body psychotherapy?
Well, actually, I didn't really work with babies. I did baby massage, which I taught to nurse schools. I had learned that massage from Eva Reich. And I
Mm,
also analyzed a few films of mother-baby relationship with Beatrice Bibi, on which we
mm-hmm,
published.
mm-hmm,
And also, I was in a seminar with Daniel Stern, where we talked a lot, of course, of mother-baby relationships. But I didn't really work with babies. That wasn't
mm-hmm,
really
mm-hmm.
my focus.
Okay, but you did have this link with psychoanalysis because of your previous experience.
Yes.
Can you talk a bit about those links with body psychotherapy?
Well, the thing is, I didn't have many links with psychoanalysis in a direct way, but I published a lot on the history of body psychotherapy and psychoanalysis.
Yes.
I also, one of my bosses, when I was a psychologist in the psychiatric institutions of Geneva, was André Henal, who is a well-known historian of psychoanalytic, the history of psychoanalysis, and who also had great respect for finding links between psychoanalysis and bodywork. Among other things, he was a Hungarian who was very influenced by Balint and Ferenczi.
Mm-hmm.
And he also married as a second wife a psychometrician who became a psychologist. And with that psychometrician called Véronique Henal, we created a laboratory to analyze facial behavior of suicidal patients with the hope that we
Oh,
could
that's
maybe
where it comes
predict
in. Mm. Mm.
the risk of suicide of people who attempted suicide. And so, and then I published a lot on how from Ferenczi and people like that, Fenichel and Reich met together, first at the university, where actually it's Fenichel who convinced Reich to become A, interested in youth movements, B, in communism, and C, in psychoanalysis.
Oh,
And
that's
then they
interesting.
both became very influential trainers of the how do you call it, the second phase of Freud's theorizing, with the id, the ego, and so on, where there was
Mm.
this idea that the ego is first of all a
A
motoric
body.
entity,
Mm.
which was
Mm.
often quoted by Ferenczi and Adler.
Mm.
And um, the first one to get interested in the body was not Reich, but was Fenichel. When he arrived in Berlin, he fell in love with the pupil of Elsa Gindler, whom he married.
Mm.
And Elsa
Oh.
Gindler cured Fenichel from his constant headaches, which psychoanalysts hadn't managed to do.
Mm.
And he then wrote the first books on the relation between muscles, breathing, and psychoanalytical work.
Mm.
He
Mm.
published that in 1828 already, but he
Wow.
believed his idea, which was also quite close to Gerda Boyesen, was the best is to that the same patient goes to somebody like Elsa Gindler and somebody like Fenichel, and that the synthesis between one
Mm.
excellent form of body work and one excellent form of psychoanalysis
Integration.
would be made by
Mm.
the patient and through discussions of a team.
Mm. Mm.
And
Oh, that's
all
so
his life,
fascinating.
Phoenicia believed that nobody can be a good body psychotherapist, a good working body specialist, if you want, and a good psychologist.
Mm. Mm. Can you say
And
that
when
link
they
between?
emigrated, yes, sorry,
I was just
yes.
going to ask you that link between Gindler and him. What was so important about Gindler's work? Because I know Gindler did a lot of expressive movement.
Well, there were quite a lot, in fact. First of all, uh, the whole Reichen family, that is his wife and his two daughters, worked with Gindler.
Mm.
But Reich at that time was divorcing, and he started going out with a woman called Elsa Lindenberg,
Mm.
who not only was a pupil of Gindler, but also to Rudolf Laban. She was
Yes.
actually she was a dancer in
Yeah.
Berlin Opera. And
Yes.
I think that it's mainly thanks to her that Reich was able to develop vegetotherapy. And when I say I
Oh.
think, a lot of other people think, like David Bodella, Courtney Young, a lot of us uh, doubt, because it seems if you read the book Reich wrote about his therapy to his son, there's a whole book by Peter Reich on his sessions with his father. It seems
Mm.
that Reich wasn't a very subtle body worker, which a bit
Mm.
confirmed Fenichel's analysis. And when
Mm.
Fenichel and Reich migrated to Oslo, actually Reich asked uh, his friend to go and work again with Fenichel's wife to deepen her knowledge of Gindler's work.
Mm. Mm. Oh,
So
that's
there were
fascinating.
many
Those
interactions which
interconnections.
mostly developed in Oslo.
Mm. In Norway, of course, and of course there are now still the remnants of Reichian analysis over there in Norway. Indeed. Um, can we move on a bit now to your seminal book on body psychotherapy? This very well researched tome, where you talk about different aspects of your research. How important is research to body psychotherapy? Do you feel?
Well, as you know, I don't make any distinction between research and body psychotherapy. I believe
Mm-hmm.
that the mind is basically part of is part of the cogwheels of an organism, and that an organism is full of various circuits, highly differentiated. I mean, it can be the nerves, it can be the bones, it can be emotions, it can be
Mm.
movements, it can be behavior, which are all connected with each other in highly differentiated ways.
Mm.
And for the moment, I would say that even by reading recent Nobel Prizes, it's obvious that we as scientists have only a very partial knowledge of that complexity. We are really discovering. And in the meantime, people still have needs to be helped.
Mm,
And so the advantage for me of body psychotherapy is that it should be called psychotherapy because from my perspective, if you want to help somebody, it's sometimes good to focus on this or that aspect. Sometimes it's good to have heart surgery. Sometimes it's good to have verbal work. But globally speaking, one should pay attention to the whole person as it functions
mm,
with the only difficulty is that very often a person has too many variables for a therapist. So anyway, he's going to have to pick and choose domains in which he's good.
mm,
But fundamentally, I would say if I look at the future of psychology, for me, body psychotherapy, dance therapy, arts therapy, verbal therapy, behavior therapy, all forms of therapy, which will need to learn to live together uh, when the theory allows them to include them. Today, one also, as you know, one does a lot of, one uses a lot of Asian methods like yoga,
mm,
meditation. They call that mindfulness. Uh,
mm,
they're now used in hospitals and clinics. So
mm, mm,
we're seeing that the existing approach of human beings today requires a multiplicity, a coordination of multiplicity of approaches, which
mm,
is why I defended the notion of team therapy. That is
mm, mm,
basically what you need is a team with different specialists which can coordinate, at least in the case of complex cases, which can
mm.
combine their different visions and knowledges to be able to find a way of helping a specific patient.
Oh, that does lead us so nicely on to your work in the psychosomatic clinic. Tell us about that.
So that clinic, to come back to Vietnam, was well, it's an old clinic in the Jura, which began for people with heart problems that needed to do sport. After they had been operated, you go to a clinic to sort of rebuild yourself. And
Mm,
so there was at first a mixture of sports and going in the country a lot and breathing fresh air and having medical
mm,
help. And slowly they started to create a psychosomatic section, which in my days was directed by a Vietnamese psychiatrist called Duc Le Quang, who had a very rich psychiatric uh, training in Belgium and Switzerland, who was also a Jungian therapist and who was practicing hypnosis. And he became also interested because of that work of how do you combine psychiatrical work, gymnastics, physiotherapy, health problems.
mm,
And that's
mm,
where he also asked me to join the team as a body psychotherapist because he had read my book on body psychotherapy. And he thought that this organismic vision could help to strengthen this team therapeutical approach of complex patients, where
mm,
you never know what is really psychological, what is really physical, and so on.
mm, indeed,
And
indeed.
this was the subject of my most recent book called The Intimate Organism. That is where you try and understand how an organism as a whole can be experienced as an intimate way of being alive.
Mm, fascinating. So you wrote a book for the team, didn't you, as well?
Called?
You wrote a book. You also wrote a book in French, as well as your book on the
No,
organismic. You wrote a book for the team.
no. There's only two books. One is a book on the history of body psychotherapy, which
Hmm.
I wrote mostly to convince my academic friends that there's enough substance in body psychotherapy, dance therapy, and those approaches to be included in future scientific research projects in psychology.
Mm.
By that time, I started explaining what body psychotherapists knew to university students in the Geneva psychology institutions.
Mm-hmm.
And I wrote a second book in French, which is in a way the opposite, which is trying to sort out the different forms of knowledge that is used in team psychotherapy in something like a clinic, because
Mm.
it's obvious that it's easy for certain people to say, yoga is not scientific,
Mm.
but it's also manifest that yoga is still the body technique that is mostly used around the world. You find a
Yeah,
yoga
indeed.
school in nearly every village of the world.
Mm.
I know of no other
Mm.
technique, and it's used in hospitals, by medical
Mm.
doctors, in medical services. So, how can you sort of create a realm of thinking in which everybody has a say? That is, the
Mm.
yoga teacher first must do what he knows how to teach, and then maybe he can start, trying to come closer and closer to academic medicine or empirical medicine and so on. But the whole book is about how can we organize teams where all these people can talk with each other and
Mm.
collaborate constructively. And as Duc Le Cang himself was a Vietnamese, he actually wrote the postface of my book,
Oh,
showing that a
wonderful.
Chinese would never think the body mind as a European would, because the
Mm.
Chinese doesn't know what a body is, he doesn't know what energy is, and yet he knows what a human being is. And
Mm.
so
Mm. Mm.
he defended the option that in the future of psychosomatics, we will need to know how to refine how all these forms of knowledge can combine in a complementary ways.
Mm. So an integrated approach sounds like.
Yeah.
Yeah, in the service of the patient, of course. Yes. And the other thing we haven't talked about, which I would like to get to, is your study of postural dynamics, which you did earlier, I believe, in your career. Can you say a little bit about that? Because we didn't cover that as we were going through the trajectory.
Yes.
I just remembered that.
Yes. Well, that was my PhD thesis. So by that time, I was already an official psychologist, and I was already a trainer in the Gerda Boyesen School. And I was gradually joining the European Association of Body Psychotherapy, where I participated in the construction of that association by being
Mm-hmm.
in the scientific committee, the ethical committee. For a while, I was in the board, I was vice president, and so on. So I was
Mm.
really involved, and I was slowly trying to find ways of combining this in a more explicit way. So
Mm-hmm.
I ended up with, for various reasons, I ended up as a subject with the postural dynamics. It was called Postural Dynamics and Social Status. So the
Oh.
basic idea, the basic question is, does social status systematically influence how people use their body postures?
Mm.
And the thesis was mainly one in experimental social psychology. And I was asked to use well-known methods of to study nonverbal communication, such as those that were, for example, proposed by Gregory Bateson, and in particular, I followed the methods taught in Bern by Siegfried Frey, who became my thesis director at the end.
Mm.
And the idea of these people is that you analyze each part of the body separately. So you analyze body, facial movements, then you analyze hand movements, then you analyze legs and or shoulder
Mm.
movements. All these movements are analyzed, let's say, every half a second for 10
Mm.
minutes
On a film, yeah.
on a film from a video film, and
Mm.
usually with
Mm.
two people interacting with each other. And
Mm-hmm.
what
Mm-hmm.
we quick and then they were analyzed by computer programs, because what we quickly saw is that we quickly had something like a million information in that dialogue,
Mm. Mm.
and that nobody has in his explicit thinking the capacity to follow an exchange of a million signs. So it became scientifically demonstrated that the richness of interaction, even if you take simple visible gestures, is incredibly complex. And when you talk of conscious or unconscious, you're just out of the road, because, well, Paul Fraisse in France, he used the word non-conscious. He says it's just
Mm.
beyond what consciousness can deal with in any way. It's not just a repressed conscious
Mm.
memory.
Mm.
It's that our whole
It's just
way of
out of,
functioning
yeah,
goes
yeah.
much, is just can't be detected consciously in an explicit way. And
Mm.
then I compared this to what I was doing in body psychotherapy, where we analyze the body as a biomechanical entity. Like, for example, in those days,
Mm-hmm.
I was somebody was doing rolfing on me, and so I learned how to look at the alignment of the back, of the feet, of the pelvis, of the neck, the fact that if I'm like this, I don't move the head the same way than if I am like that, and that there's a whole
Mm-hmm.
mechanical structure of the body, which without which body workers could not work, in fact. And of
Mm.
course, not people who studied nonverbal behavior had no inkling of that realm of
Mm.
postural
Mm.
dynamics. I try to see what each of these two ways of looking at the body could allow us to learn from what I was observing. And I noticed that there were really two complementary worlds. That
Mm.
is, what you could see with one way of looking could not be seen with the other way of looking, and vice
Mm.
versa. And
Mm.
so the conclusion of the thesis was to expose those two ways of looking at somebody and opening a discussion without any conclusion on the interest of combining these ways of looking at behavior.
Mm. Mm. Fascinating. Different pairs of glasses.
Yes.
Different ways of seeing and seeing different
Uh,
things as well,
uh,
both of which are complex and important. Is there anything you want to talk about, Michael, that's of interest to you at this moment, right now, going forward?
well, I have nothing new. I mean, my main focus after that work on psychosomatics is really how to find explicit ways that can be taught in supervision or in training groups or through publications on how to travel through the different layers
Mm.
that create the intimacy of an organism. How do I go from a hand gesture to an image of a dream, to a way of breathing, to a noise in my belly? And how
Mm.
do I
Mm.
join all that also with family history? Because I notice that most of these coordinations, they're automatic. The best word I know is the one of Piaget, who, his thesis was on automatic behavior.
Mm.
And there's obvious automatic links within the organism that create themselves through centuries. And often
Epigenetics.
ways of managing, of mixing things, of blending
Mm.
things.
Oh.
And I often
Mm-hmm.
tell my patients, don't think you can solve all the problems you receive from your parents. If your children have a more constructive education than the one you received, you've already done a lot of work. But in
Mm.
one
Mm.
life, one doesn't solve all the problems that animates one,
No.
because when you think of those millions of mechanisms that organize what I'm doing or saying right now, uh, I can't be perfect in any way, but I
And
may
the
find ways.
generations. The
Yes,
generations of DNA,
yes,
generations. Yeah.
yes,
You can
yeah,
only
yeah,
do what you can do in your one life.
exactly.
Yeah. How interesting. And of course, epigenetics is a growing field, isn't it? In our work in psychotherapy. Oh, well, I think probably we've covered most of the main areas. Is there anything you wanted to cover that we haven't covered
No, I
in
think
your
I
career?
think you've covered most of the things that I wanted to talk of today.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you so much, Michael, for your time. And we really appreciate, your wonderful teachings. Thank you. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
And thank you very much for your support and understanding and way of helping
Not
me
at all.
to say what I'm trying to say as clearly as
Not at
possible.
all. It's been wonderful. Thank you.